It was September 13th, 2019, the day of my 69th birthday party. I had prepared everything with so much care. I invited the whole family, but more than anyone, I was waiting for him. My Ryan, my boy who was already 45 years old, yet would always be my baby. The table had been set since 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I had bought a new dress, emerald green, the color my late husband Charles always said made my eyes shine. The neighbors brought gifts and chatted happily, but my eyes were only searching for one person. Ryan had promised to arrive at 6. I hadn't seen him in months. 6:30 passed, then 7, 8 o'clock. My heart tightened with anxiety with every minute that went by. That was when my daughter-in-law Isabella arrived alone, her eyes red. She quietly told me that Ryan wasn't coming, that he had decided to cut off all contact with me, and with her as well. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of joke. It didn't make sense that my son would stop speaking to me or to his own wife. Isabella told me she had discovered the truth through messages. Ryan had a mistress, and he had already decided to move to Canada with her, a younger woman who had convinced him that I was nothing but a negative influence in his life, that I was too controlling, and that he needed to free himself from me in order to be happy. Me, who had dedicated every breath of my life to his well-being, was now just a burden he wanted to get rid of. 45 years raising that boy, sacrificing everything for him, even going hungry so that he would never lack a thing, and he abandoned me like that on my birthday without even the courage to tell me to my face. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my backyard and cried until I had no tears left. The red velvet cake I had baked with so much love remained untouched on the table. The candles, never blown out, melted completely. And I swore to myself that if my son had abandoned me, I too would learn to live without him. I never imagined that 3 years later, he would return knocking on my door, not out of love or regret, but out of pure need and desperation. The 3 years that followed were the hardest of my life. Every morning I woke up waiting to hear the phone ring, hoping it was Ryan asking for forgiveness, admitting he had made a terrible mistake. But the silence was his answer. My neighbors looked at me with pity. They spread it around the neighborhood that I was a poor woman abandoned by her own son. Isabella would visit me sometimes, bringing news of my grandchildren. With tears in her eyes, she told me the children asked about their father, and she no longer knew what to say. During that time, I tried to go on with my life. I went back to church, where I prayed every morning for my son's soul. But nothing could fill the immense emptiness Ryan had left behind, and no matter how much I tried to move forward, the pain never truly went away. Every September 13th on my birthday, I prepared a small altar with his childhood photo, lit candles, and prayed that he would find his way back home. My friends told me to forget, to move on, but how does a mother forget a piece of her own heart? In 2021, it had been 10 years since my husband Charles passed away, and the house where I live remains the only inheritance he left me. When we got married, we bought this property with great sacrifice, the fruit of our hard work, with hardly a moment of rest. It was our dream, our security for old age. In his will, Charles had left the house divided between me and Ryan, 50% each. I never cared about that division. I always thought that when my time came, everything would belong to my son anyway. I never imagined that this inheritance would be the reason he came back into my life, but not in the way I had dreamed. During those years of silence, I learned to be strong on my own. I learned that a mother's love should not mean abandonment, and above all, I learned to value my own company. It was a Monday in March 2022, almost 3 years after that terrible night of my birthday. I was in the backyard watering my jasmine flowers when I heard someone knocking at the front door. My heart raced. There was something familiar about that knock, a rhythm I had known since Ryan was a little boy. When I opened the door, there he was, with a few wrinkles that hadn't been there before, but still, he was my son. He greeted me so cheerfully, and for a moment I thought he had come back to apologize, to hug me, and to say he had made the greatest mistake of his life. My mother's heart nearly gave in. I almost ran into his arms like in the old days. But there was something in his eyes, an indifference that kept me rooted where I stood. He said he needed to talk to me about something important. He walked into the house as if nothing had happened, as if 3 years of abandonment were just a small misunderstanding. He sat in the same chair where his father used to sit to read the newspaper every morning. Then he explained that he had found out he needed my signature in order to sell our house. He claimed the house belonged to both of us, but that he needed his share now. The buyer would only go through with the deal if both owners signed the deed. At that moment, I understood everything. He hadn't come back for me. He hadn't come back out of love or regret. He had come back for the house, for the money. The house that his father and I had built with such sacrifice had become more important to him than the mother who had given birth to him and raised him. When I asked if he was going through financial trouble, he answered bluntly that his business had gone bankrupt and that Stella was pregnant. Stella was the young girlfriend, the one who had convinced him to abandon his wife, his children, and his own mother. Now they wanted my home, my legacy, to build their life together, a life that had no place for me. Ryan spoke for almost an hour, explaining how the sale would be good for everyone, how he would give me my share of the money and I could buy something smaller, more suitable for someone my age. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor, as if it were some grand act of generosity on his part. He never mentioned the 3 years of silence. He never apologized for the pain he had caused. He never asked how I was, if I needed anything, if I missed him. While he spoke, I watched the man my boy had become. Where was the young man who used to hug me tight and tell me I was the best mother in the world? The man sitting in front of me was a complete stranger. I told him I would think about his request. That was all I could manage to say in that moment. Ryan seemed irritated by my answer. He clearly expected me to sign the papers immediately, without question, just as I had always done when he was a child and asked for anything. He told me impatiently that there wasn't much to think about, that it was just a signature. After he left, I sat down on my couch, and all the memories came rushing back at once. I remembered when Ryan was born, after 3 miscarriages that had almost made me give up on becoming a mother. I remembered the sacrifices Charles and I made to give him the best education possible so he could study business administration. I also remembered the day he introduced me to his first wife, Isabella, and how I welcomed her like a daughter. How I cared for my grandchildren when they were born, spending entire nights rocking them so Ryan and Isabella could sleep. I remembered family Sundays, the meals I prepared with so much love, the birthdays, the Christmases, the happy moments I thought would last forever. But I also remembered the humiliation of that September 13th, 2019. I remembered the shame I felt in front of the neighbors, the nights I cried myself to sleep out of exhaustion, the days I could barely get out of bed from so much sadness. I remembered how my blood pressure spiked so high in those first months after the abandonment that I had to be hospitalized twice. For a week, Ryan called me every day, demanding an answer. His voice grew more impatient, more demanding each time. He told me I was complicating something simple, that all I had to do was sign the papers, and that was it, that he needed the money urgently. It was on Friday of that week that everything became clear to me. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I looked at the table where, 3 years earlier, I had set the birthday cake that was never cut. There, in that same spot, I realized that my answer was not just about a house or money. It was about the value I placed on myself as a person, as a mother, as a woman who had dedicated her entire life to her family. That night, I called the lawyer, Dr. Andrew, the same one who had handled the will when Charles passed away. I told him I needed to know exactly what my rights were regarding this house. The conversation we had changed everything. It changed not only my decision about the inheritance, but also the woman I believed myself to be. The following Monday, Ryan came to my house with the sales papers and a golden pen. He told me he had come to get my signature, that the buyer was waiting, and they couldn't afford to lose the deal. He spread the documents out on my kitchen table, the same table where I had served him thousands of meals over the years. I asked him to sit next to me, told him I needed to share a few things first. Ryan checked his watch, clearly impatient, but sat down. He told me there was no need for us to talk right then, that once I signed the papers, we could talk as much as I wanted. I said no, it had to be right then. And so I told him that during those 3 years, I had discovered something very important. When his father died, he hadn't left just half of the house to Ryan. He had left a very specific clause in the will, one that Ryan had never bothered to fully read. For the first time since he had walked into my house, Ryan looked at me attentively. He asked what clause I was talking about. I explained that the clause stated that his share of the inheritance would only be given to him when I, Leah, decided to leave the house or, of my own free will, chose to sell it. His father knew him better than I ever imagined. Charles knew that one day Ryan might try to throw me out of the house out of self-interest, and he wanted to protect me. Ryan stammered that it wasn't possible, but I saw in his eyes that he knew I was telling the truth. I went on to say that when he abandoned me, when he cut off all contact with me, he had automatically lost his share of the inheritance. Ryan's blood pressure seemed to drop. He turned pale, his hands trembled. He begged me, said I couldn't do this to him, that he was my son. I answered that yes, he was my son. He was the son I had loved more than my own life. The son for whom I would have given everything, even this house, if he had asked with love instead of demanding with arrogance. But he was also the son who humiliated me on my birthday, who abandoned me as if I were trash left on the side of the road, who treated me as though I were dead for 3 years. Ryan tried to speak, but I continued, saying that if he had come back asking for forgiveness, if he had come back with love, I would have signed those papers without even reading them. But he came back treating me like an obstacle standing between him and money. He came back as if I owed him something, as if my signature were an obligation and not a favor. He begged me, said he needed that money, and for the first time in years, I saw tears in his eyes. I replied that I, too, had needed my son. I needed a phone call on my birthdays, a hug on Mother's Day, to know that he still loved me. But he had decided I didn't deserve any of that. Ryan walked out of my house that day without saying another word. In the months that followed, he tried to challenge my decision legally, but the lawyers confirmed that the clause was valid and that I had every right to keep the property. Today, I still live in my little house. Ryan never came back. Sometimes Isabella visits me with my grandchildren. She told me she knows Ryan regrets it, but that his pride won't allow him to come and ask for forgiveness. I am still his mother, and my heart still aches for him every single day. But I have learned that loving someone does not mean accepting mistreatment. I have learned that even a mother's love has limits, and that my dignity was not for sale at any price. If my son ever comes back, not for money, but for true love, he will find a mother with open arms. But he will also find a woman who has learned to value herself, who has understood that self-worth has no age, and that true forgiveness only happens when there is genuine repentance. This is my story, the story of a mother who loved too much, suffered too much, but who found the strength to say no when she had to. And you, what would you have done in my place?